Okay, so welcome everybody to our 156th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. This is another hybrid version. Very happy to have Rob Simmons and reach across and touch him there, but I won't do it too much to disturb him when he's giving his presentation. Rob's giving a really fascinating sounding talk entitled, when I can find it, I'll look over my shoulder, Do Sport Analytics Affect Player Pay? Insights from New Contract Data. Before Rob starts, a few administrative announcements. You may have seen that the deadline for submitting an abstract for the conference here in Reading, the third Reading Football Economics Conference, joined with the Sports Economics Sports Management Conference, meaning that you don't have to submit a football paper. If you've got a non-football paper, you can submit to the conference. If you are still wishing to submit to that or to the conference being organised by Joachim Prinz and Bernd Frick in Duisburg, you can still do so. Happy to accept late submissions. And drop me an email as well if you plan to do that, or have a quick chat with me. There's another pressing deadline if you're interested in the Euro Working Group, OR, Operations Research and Sport. They have a conference which is going to be at the same time as the North American Association of Sports Economics sessions at the Western Economic Association Conference. The OR in Sport Euro is in Copenhagen, June the 30th to July the 3rd. And that deadline is coming up very shortly on March the 3rd, so Sunday. You might want to submit to that in Copenhagen, and I will put details on how you can submit to that in the chat once Rob has got going. The other deadline coming up in 2 weeks' time is for the ESEA conference, and also the conference organised by Raphael Fleck, Carl Singleton and Romain Gario in Zurich. That deadline is coming up on March the 15th as well. So Rob is now going to take away his talk, and so I'm going to turn my camera off and it will switch back to Rob. Rob, all yours.
Thanks, James, for all of that. It's great to be here in person in Reading. I made it this time. Still a train strike up my way, but that's I'll deal with that later on. So it's great to be here. I gave a talk to the students for James's sports economics class yesterday, so I kind of feel nicely warmed up from that, because that was about player labour markets as well. So this is going to be a presentation some of you may have heard already. It was given at the Western Economic Association last year in San Diego, and also the European Sports Meeting in Cork. But I think I can say that the paper has moved on a bit since then. We've done some extra work and found some new results, which we're pleased to be able to show you today. It's joint work with David Butler from University College Cork, and Alex Farnell, who's on the call, at Maynooth University. So the difficult questions can go to Alex here. So I'm going to press on. What we're going to do in this paper is link sports analytics in terms of advanced performance metrics and connect those to a player salary model. And we're going to use, as the title suggests, new contract data. More of that as we proceed. So this fellow here is heavily involved in the use of data in football, especially Premier League football. It's Matthew Benham. He's the owner and I think chairman of Brentford.
Chairman, but he's
certainly the owner, right? He's the owner of Brentford Football Club, a small club who are holding their own just about in the Premier League right now. Indeed. So Matthew Benham was also involved in another small club in Denmark, Midland, and his approach is to make full use of statistics and data in his recruitment strategy for players. This has been very successful. So a few years ago, Brentford were in League One, which is our third tier, So they've had several promotions and got all the way up to the Premier League. That season, they had the distinctive feature of being the only club to beat Manchester City twice, as Manchester City emerged as champions. So that was quite an achievement, and they beat some other big teams as well, like Liverpool. So they are indeed holding their own. Benham's approach was a bit like Billy Beane at the Oakland A's in baseball with the now famous Moneyball case. So Benham hired statisticians, and he was kind of brought into this from his own background, which was in finance. He made a lot of money in the City of London as a financial analyst, and he's brought that to bear on football. He's a very far-sighted fellow, actually. One of the things he did was to buy land in West London. He's very wealthy, of course, so he could afford to buy this land. And that land became used for a new football stadium, entirely privately funded, you'll notice, unlike US, and is now a kind of smart, state-of-the-art stadium. So he's kind of innovative, very entrepreneurial, and he's used statisticians. He had two directors of football, not just one, and he's very close to in terms of monitoring statistics, recognizing what players can and cannot do, and that's one of his quotes. You should be careful about signing a player who scores 20 goals from 40 shots, because that might be just a one-off freak season, for example. So there is a link between this paper and Moneyball, the use of statistics to hire players. But the trouble is, as Bill Gerard pointed out some way back, we've got here what Bill called a complex invasion team sport with lots of interactions between teammates. And going back to the early 2000s, data were not really, they were available, but only with some difficulty and at cost from a company called Opta. But fortunately for academics like us, the tracking data has improved massively and is now publicly available at no cost, actually. Well, no financial cost, as David found out. The cost in terms of effort of scraping this stuff is not trivial at all. So there's various ways that you could apply a Moneyball type principle to football. For example, you could, as the bottom paper shows, you could think about the allocation of wage expenditure on particular groups of players. For example, would you benefit in terms of team points from reallocating payroll from forwards to defenders? That paper emerged in Applied Economics. So there's lots of salary models out there. I had an overview in Journal of Sports Economics recently. The theory behind all this is that we tend to think of player pay in football, our football, as based on bargaining between a player's agent and club executives. So you end up with a bargaining model, basically. Early work on salary models, empirical work, was limited by both poor salary data and poor performance data. And several studies have made use of things like journalist ratings, but there's a recent paper by Jan van Oors and Federico Principe, European Economic Review, which pointed out that sometimes journalist ratings can be biased. In fact, they found a source of bias against some black players in Italy's Serie A. So the ratings could be misleading in that sense. Carrieri, in a paper in Oxford Economic Papers, brought popularity of players into the salary model. So that's a way of getting at superstar effects, but also bargaining power by their own kind of proxy measure based on agents' coverage of particular player contracts. So what we're going to do? Well, what we're doing here is take some more advanced performance metrics and apply those to a salary model. And we also look exclusively at players who just signed a new contract. So the players we have that we look at are in the first year of a new contract. Now, new contract could mean moving to a different club on the transfer market in Europe, or it could mean renewal at an existing club. So we're going to set up various models. I'm going to shower you with lots of results, although we've kind of edited these down today because otherwise the tables will look a bit crazy. We've got lots of measures of performance that we can look at, and this is really the main problem of the paper actually. How do we distill those complicated measures into something remotely sensible as an econometric salary model? Oh, sorry, I've gone up rather than down. There we go. Well, this is the kind of general format. We'll have log salary, we'll have various controls for career experience in terms of numbers of appearances. We know if the players are currently a full international, that means they play for their national team. We know how many minutes they played in the previous season, and so on. So we've got plenty to bite on here. The salary measure itself comes from a source called Capology, which is an online source, and it covers all European leagues, but we're going to restrict attention here to Italy, Serie A, and England, English Premier League. And the reason we're going to do that is because Capology tells us which salaries have been verified in terms of being extracted from player agents. Now, if that column is not ticked, then the salary is filled in by algorithm. And we want to avoid that because all we'll end up doing with our salary model, if we brought that in, brought those data in, is simply end up replicating whatever algorithm that the people use at Capology. And they're not telling us that, right? That is private information. We don't know what the algorithm is containing. So we're going to look at salary at the point of signing a new contract. And we're doing this because if we register salary in a given season, ignoring that, then we're kind of arguing that the salary is determined by previous performance, but it isn't really previous at all, because the player is in the second or third year of their long-term contract. So we want to get at salary at the point of signing and link that to the performance in the previous season. And that should get us a much tighter relationship between the salary and performance. As it turns out, this is a typical kind of contract format. This is very common indeed. Now, this applies to a particular player. I think he's retired now. He was at Chelsea and moved on to Manchester United. And his contract at Chelsea in 2011 was a 5-year contract. And the thing that hits you is that apart from the first year, the salary profile is flat. It's the same salary each year for the lifetime of that contract. This is basic pay though. If Chelsea won things, and they did during this period, Juan Mata would get a bonus, a performance-related bonus, and that bonus will typically be loaded at team level. There might be some individual component for goals scored or something like that, but however much Chelsea won in terms of winning points in the league, progress in the Champions League, that kind of thing, there would be a team bonus which would be quite substantial, and Juan Mata would benefit from that. So that's the typical footballer's profile. There are lots of these contracts around. Now, what about performance then? Performance varies, we know that, and there's a kind of strand of literature, which I don't want to get too far into here, because it provokes a lot of debate, about moral hazard and shirking. And the guy on the right is Emmett Ozil, who is kind of notorious because he's been called out in various media and also by various fans for not pulling his weight in an Arsenal shirt. So that there was even a kind of episode on the highlights program we have here called Match of the Day, where the pundits spent a lot of time dissecting his lack of performance and even highlighting his kind of stationary position on the football field, and arguing that he wasn't really doing much. Actually, the game in question I was at, it was a Manchester City game when Manchester City beat Arsenal very heavily. And Ozil was singled out as kind of to blame almost. Wasn't alone, but to blame for that bad result. Now, actually, a paper that I have with Tunde Baraimo and Bernd Frick looked at contract duration explicitly, and we found that the selection effects of awarding a long-term contract dominated the shirking effect. So basically, the longer duration of contract left for a player was associated positively with the player performance there. So in that sense, Ozil emerges as an exception rather than the general rule here. So our data for players who just signed a new contract was manually constructed very painfully. So on the contract side, how do we know that it's a new contract? Well, we delved deep into club websites, players' Wikipedia biographies and things like that. Also, Transfermarkt gives us a lot of information about contracts. As I said before, it's just two leagues, Serie A and Premier League, to be sure that the salaries have been verified. This gives us 739 players over a 4-year period. The reason for that time frame is that the advanced metrics only really begin in 2017-18. So the years nominated there are where the salary is recorded. We want the performance 1 year back, and that takes us to 2017-18. Well, that's when our performance source comes in. What is that performance source? Well, it's a wonderful website full of fantastic statistics called fbref.com. And it looks for Americans, when you go there, you'll see it's very familiar indeed. It's exactly like Baseball Reference, Pro Football Reference for NFL. It's got the same sort of template there. Even the way it's set up and looks is exactly like that. So the salary distributions look like this. So this is familiar territory in any sport, actually, that you've got some top players who are earning far more than the average type players. We've split that down both by league and by allocated position. The position is as nominated by the website, by the way. It's not something that we've made up. Now, out there to the right is indeed a superstar. So in this data set, we have a particular player who's well known. Cristiano Ronaldo was playing for Juventus within this data set, and he had an extraordinarily high salary, just his basic pay as well. So what we're going to do then is to link the salary to various kinds of performance measures. Now, this one is worth a bit of discussion. Expected goals, not the goals actually scored, but thinking about the probability of a goal being scored given the shot location, the angle of the shot, and the type of shot, whether it's a free kick or open play, for example. And this is computed by some people at StatsBomb. It's an algorithm-based measure. And the idea behind it is to remove the luck part in goals scored. Now, this has become very popular. It appears now in journalist match reports and in TV broadcasts. And a very interesting paper, Applied Expected Goals, came out recently in the Journal of Sports Economics. So Breschow and Flepp from Zurich argued that expected goals was a superior measure to actual goals when evaluating both players and coaches. And the nice thing about their paper is how they show teams can make mistakes. They can wrongly extend a head coach contract and then find the performance is not what was desired. The example they have is a head coach at Swansea, who were then in the Premier League. but not long after got relegated. The other one, in reverse, is that you may dismiss a head coach, fire the coach, again, wrongly, because you made the wrong evaluation. And the case there that they show is Villarreal in Spain. And the authors show that if you'd used expected goals to make these evaluations, you would probably come up with a different decision. So this is an interesting measure. So what Brescia and Flett didn't do, and which we're going to do, is consider whether expected goals might be a useful predictor of player salary. So that's going to be part of our modelling. So just to show you what expected goals looks like, take the left-hand picture. This is Erling Haaland, not at Manchester City at the time. This is his plot for a season at Borussia Dortmund. And the circles represent expected goals in terms of probability of the goal being scored. So naturally, the further in he is, close to the goal line, 6-yard box as we call it in football, there's a very broad circle there, large diameter, and of course, there's a high chance that shot in that position is going to make it into the back of the net, whereas further out, there's lower chance. So one of his shots that is a small blob by what we call the D, the edge of the penalty area, which is about 20 yards out, something like that. Now, actually, Haaland is a bit good, and what he manages to achieve is a high number of goals relative to what would be expected. So his actual goals minus expected goals turns out to be a very high number, and it certainly was last season for Manchester City because he broke records and got 36 Premier League goals. And there's another one to the right at team level now. So the left-hand panel is individual, the right-hand one is what it would look like for a team, which turns out to be Getafe in Spain's La Liga. So this is an interesting measure, perhaps. And you can have expected assists as well. And the NP, which we will be using, so henceforth, when I talk about expected goals, I'm going to be using the non-penalty version. That's the NP. So we'll take penalties out of the picture there. Now, this shows us the complexity of what we're dealing with. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through every bullet point here, because that's a bit too much. It's just to kind of gives you a rough picture of what we can get hold of here. For example, key passes, pass completions. Not only pass completions, but where they're completed on the field. So we've got short pass completion, medium, long-term, or long pass completion there. Progressive means forwards. Progressive distance, progressive carries, that means moving forward with the ball. We've got passes received. We've got a whole load of defensive measures, which might be interested, because obviously expected goals is more applicable to strikers, forwards, and attacking midfield players, not so much for defenders. An important aspect of modern football is pressure. This is pressurizing the opposition to give up the ball. Basketball fans will know what I'm talking about here. It's applying pressure on the player to get what you would call a turnover. And successful pressures are important because then, of course, you get the ball and you can build an attack. And that's measured in the FBref website. And there are more familiar defensive measures like blocks, interceptions, clearances, and so on. Then at the bottom right, we've got some measures at team level. Hockey fans will know about this. We're going to be talking a bit further on about something called plus minus. This is goals for minus goals conceded while a given player is on the field. So the substitutions in football, right now you can have 5 substitutions in the game. Unlike American sports, the substitutions, though, are kind of permanent. Once a player's come off, you can't come back on again. You can substitute the substitute, though, which sometimes confuses some particular players. You subbed me off, coach. Why did you do that? Well, you weren't doing much, or some tactical change needed there. So we have plus minus, and that's an interesting measure for us. The estimation is a basic salary model. We have some control variables. These include age and age squared, the type of contract, Was this a contract renewal at a given team? Now, we have a loan system in football. Is there a player who is loaned out by a parent club to play somewhere else? And that's quite common, very common in Italy, actually. Transfer means that you transfer your registration from one team to another. Minutes last season, are you an international player? And career minutes, actually it's career minutes, not just appearances. We have a threshold for appearing in the sample at all. We don't want to throw in players who might sort of skew the data because they scored one goal from one shot and they were only on the field for 5 minutes. We don't really want that, so we restrict observations to minutes in a season to be at least 450. The positions are given to us by the website, and we're going to interact the positions with performance measures. Now, our approach is to start with a basic intuitive model and then build up into some more advanced measures. And we're going to show results from both ordinary least squares and a popular approach now, given the skewness of the data, is unconditional quantile regression. So we'll do both. Obviously, we've got lots and lots of variables here, so this begs a question about how we strategize this. We're going to use a lot of discretion, just to warn you, and we are conscious that there's a whole load of multicollinearity going on here between the measures. Now, two approaches which we've tried, but in the end we're not going to go forward with, so apologies if Alex Krumer's on the call. As I know he's a fan of this, lasso regressions, least absolute shrinkage and selection operator through machine learning. Okay, well, I'll talk to him separately about this, I'm sure. But we're not going to go with that. We weren't happy with the results we got from that approach. Stepwise estimation involves mechanically adding or removing variables based on p-values or t-statistics, if you prefer. We're not going to do that either. So we've got a kind of ad hoc intuitive approach going on here with our model selections. So just to quickly, I want to get to the results, so I'll sort of go through this really quick. We worry if we use ordinary conditional quantile regressions, the conventional Q-reg type things, that these produce results that are not generalizable to the population, and you might go into trouble because players you think are in the 90th quantile may not actually be that way if you don't model rigorously through a procedure to actually put them in the 90th quantile. So there's a kind of selection issue here. Are the players that, like Cristiano Ronaldo, really in the 90th quantile of salary? Can they be placed there through quantile regression? Well, you can do this, and this is all done these days on a stata routine, but this is the sort of nuts and bolts of it all. You compute a sample quantile, estimate the density of the salary distribution, and grind out a binary variable if the observation salary is less or equal to the observed quantile. And then what you've got is a binary variable, and then you can regress that on the covariates. It's essentially a rescaled linear probability model. And that routine is now well established in Stata. Now, to start things off, we sort of wanted to put the question, would a composite player rating be a useful predictor of player salary? There's a nice sort of rating measure out there which is not based on journalists or Kicker magazine or something like that. Is computed by algorithm in a website called Who Scored. And what the programmers do is start with a base number of 6, and they add to that using a weighted player contribution, obviously higher weights for goals and assists, but there's weights for things like pass completions and interceptions and things like that. Unfortunately, we don't know what's in this algorithm. We just know that it's not a subjective measure like the journalist scores. Now, if you look at the actual raw data from this, then Messi and Ronaldo do indeed end up at the real top end. But actually the distribution's fairly narrow here, 6.15 to 7.94. the highest rating was indeed to Cristiano Ronaldo when playing for Juventus in 2018-19. He got 7.94. He's the guy with that top end maximum rating, as it were. So is this a possible predictor of player salary? The answer turns out, and we were surprised by this, the answer is yes. Also, what's interesting is when you apply the rating from who scored, the coefficients are pretty much equal. We can't reject the hypothesis that those coefficients, for example, defender versus midfield, defender versus forward even, those coefficients turn out to be not significantly different from each other. So you can indeed collapse that into a measure. And the great thing about that is that it lets the defender's performances be present when thinking about salary, whereas they wouldn't be if you just used expected goals or goals. Okay. Now, next up, we're going to think about some basic measures that have been well established and pre-exist before fbref.com. They've always been there. So these are things that you can drag out. Goals, assists, pass completion, shooting accuracy. That's the proportion of shots taken that are on target. You have to be careful with that. James and I had a conversation earlier. Turns out if the shot hits the post, it isn't, and doesn't go in the net, it's not on target. If it goes in the net, well, it's a goal, well, fantastic, and of course it's on target. So that's a bit weird, but that's how they do it. Now, shooting accuracy for the forwards turns out to have a positive and significant coefficient in the salary model. This is just basic OLS with controls, with the fixed effects for teams and years and league and so on. Pass completion seems to matter for defenders. Of course, there's a whole load of stuff that's not going to be important at all, and we'll come to that next. But I want to refer to another broad indicator, the plus-minus measure. Goals for minus goals against while the player is on the field. Very much like the plus-minus in hockey, and I think it's also used in basketball. Now, this has been criticised for the obvious problem that this isn't really about necessarily the player as an individual. You can get a high plus-minus because of the contributions by your teammates. So in hockey, I gather, and I've not got further into this, but it'd be an interesting exercise to follow up. Corsi and Fenwick measures have been used and are available on the Pro Hockey website to register players' performances going a bit beyond plus-minus. Also, and I only realised this recently, the expected goals can be adapted into a plus-minus format, and a paper by Karat, Mikhail and co-authors used an expected points plus-minus as well. So these are interesting measures. The authors in that paper used them to form player rankings, who's the best player in Europe kind of idea. Also league rankings, which is the best league in European football. But they didn't relate it to salaries, so that's another sort of dimension that we can follow up on. Now, we're going to get a bit deeper. We're going to look at particular more advanced measures. The left-hand column doesn't use the plus-minus, the right-hand column does. Now, one thing to note immediately, which is kind of hidden from view here, is a whole load of variables which didn't make the cut here. Especially, we found defensive contributions. So things like blocks, interceptions, and tackles are simply absent from the model, not because we've neglected them, but because they are essentially insignificant when we bring them in. Interestingly, defenders' shot creation comes in, but it comes in negatively, which is a bit weird also. So this is not a particularly satisfactory model, I should say. We've got some examples of wrong sign coefficients, and it's not really telling us a full story. And also to note, which is kind of buried here, if you go back a little bit, if you think about the who scored stuff with an R squared of 0.742 or 741, and if you look at this thing, the R squared is actually not much better. So we're not getting a better fit, out of this model compared to the one with the broad indicator. So we're not doing very well so far with those specific measures. Expected goals might, though, be giving us some impact here. We also look at unconditional quantile regression. Now, the who scored measure, if we go back to that, has significant coefficients at 0.25, 0.75 and 0.9 quantiles. It does especially well at the top end of the salary distribution, not so much at the bottom end, and unfortunately not at the median either. If we use the basic measures, rather than give you a really big and complicated table that's hard to read, we'll just summarize what are the significant effects here. We're using position interactions all the way through in this set. Pass completion rate matters at the lower end of salary distribution. Touches, shooting accuracy to some extent matter higher up, midfield times touches. But not many of our advanced measures make the cut. That's the message so far. We've got all these complicated statistics, very deep. We don't just know the pass completion, we know the length of the pass completion, for example, and we're just not getting much mileage out of this. We do get a bit with the long pass completion rate there, but not all the way through. Not all the way through the quantiles. There's nothing systematic out of that. For example, defence times carries, only significant at 0.75. Forwards expected goals, well, there's a bit there at the top end, the very top end, at 0.9. We're not getting much in the way of significance from our particular advanced measures all the way through the salary distribution. Now, if we put plus minus into the picture, it starts to look a bit more useful. The plus minus measure is indeed a good predictor of salary from 0.25 upwards through the distribution.
Hello, can I ask a question, Rob? It's Carl.
Hi, Carl.
Sorry to interrupt. I didn't know. Yeah. Can I check interpretation?
Sure.
So, is the way to interpret the marginal effect here that the quantile of the unconditional distribution is sensitive to changing that variable by 1 unit for all the players?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Sorry, just checking I had that right. So that's basically saying that some of these variables would shift the 90th percentile if one player had 1 unit better XG.
Yes, across all the players. You're absolutely right. That's a great way of presenting it, actually.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thanks for the clarification from your side. That was useful. So, yeah, sorry, I'll stay with this. The plus minus is giving us some explanatory power here. If we took out the position interactions, it would work pretty well. Here we've kind of given a bit more detail, defence times plus minus midfield. And the great thing about the plus minus is that, as I said before, it's allowing defenders' contributions to be integrated into the model, which you wouldn't get from the expected goals, because that's clearly loaded onto forwards and attacking midfielders. Okay. So, I mean, that gives you a picture of what it might look. I've frozen out the control variables in this. It's not just this, and you've got the fixed effects behind the scenes. But there's a whole load of asterisks here, which is rather more pleasing than some of the results before. So a combination of expected goals and plus minus would do well in predicting salary through the quantile approach, through the salary distribution there. Okay. Now, earlier on, I used the who scored composite measure. So a further question is, would plus minus beat who scored in a kind of competition for significance here? Here I'm starting to think about an encompassing model. First of all, let's worry about the correlation. Now, it turns out expected goals and plus minus are highly correlated, which is no great surprise. That's a bit of a truism, really. But who scored measure and plus minus gets you a correlation coefficient of around 0.4. So that's a bit more interesting, really. And the bottom line here is if we put both who scored and plus minus in a full salary model, actually it's the plus minus that wins out. So positions times plus minus dominate the who scored rating and the specific individual metrics when explaining the variation in player salaries. And that's actually our fundamental conclusion so far. Now, next up, since we started talking about Moneyball earlier, what we're going to do here, and this is kind of under construction, so results were kind of pouring out during the week in the build-up to this talk, even as up to yesterday, actually. So we're still working on this. We wanted to ask whether the measures we've got actually explain team results. Now we're going to apply this at player level, so it's the same data set, but each player's season has attributed to it the team points per game for that season, if that makes sense. Okay, so it's the same sample size, the same data set, but now we've got a points per game model. And of course, I mean, it's a tautology, isn't it? Goals and assists will explain points per game. But what else does? Well, pass completion rate does, and touches do. And then when we interact those variables with the positions, again, we've got this going through. Actually, for touches, it makes no difference between position, and it's exactly the same, and so on. So this is over and above the obvious variables of goals and assists. Now, the trouble is these measures weren't so great at explaining salary. Let's throw expected goals into the mix. Well, clearly expected goals and points per game are going to be correlated. That's obvious too. But what about the underlying measures? Behind the expected goals, you've got creation of shots, you've got pass completions, and you've got moving the ball forward through progressive distance. That's the distance of the passes going forward. You'll notice that rules out sideways and back. So lots of defenders in modern football are playing the ball to each other or back to the goalkeeper. In a large part of the game is actually that kind of rather boring type of play. That turns out to be, well, the progressive distance turns out to be a relevant predictor of points per game. But notice also the bottom one, successful pressing, is also important for the points that you get. If you have a team that's highly athletic and mobile and is good at regaining possession from the opposition, because that's what successful press is. It's actually a rate. It's the proportion of presses which turn out to result in a turnover for your team. It doesn't track what happens afterwards, because you might give them a ball straight back. But it's the rate of successful presses, and that turns out to be important for winning games. It wasn't so important for salary. So again, we can put expected goals back in. We've got all that stuff, shot creation, pass completion, but really it's the long passes completed that matter for gaining points in English and Italian football. Turns out the forwards pressing is important. In old-fashioned football, forwards just used to kind of slope around near the penalty area, hang around and score the odd goal or two. They wouldn't have been expected to work in terms of regaining possession off of the defence. Now they are instructed to do this, and they must do this, otherwise they won't be picked for the team. So that turns out to be an important feature, and quite rightly, because this is a contribution to gaining points in football. We can put the plus-minus measure into the same points per game model. Again, we're asking the question, is plus-minus a sufficient statistic for explaining points achieved by teams? And it's not. Long pass completion, shot creation, and successful presses are again important over and above the very obvious plus-minus measure. So, final bit. And this again is very, very loose, and I mislaid my notebook. Oh, I see. Right, because I really am going to go up to the minute and show you some very latest results. So we've got three parts to this table. Which measures predict points and salary? Well, the obvious ones do. Goals, expected goals, and plus minus. which variables predict points but not salary. So these are variables which we think from the previous work affect points per game, but they're absent in the salary model because the coefficients are insignificant. Assists, shot creation, and progressive distance passes. And then finally, are there some variables which predict salary but not points? Well, we only found one. That's progressive distance carry. That's the number of carries. It's not the amount of yards gained. Sorry, it is the amount of yards gained. It's the distance of a carry. Beg your pardon. Progressive means forwards. So it's the amount of, it is in yards, the amount of distance carried forward with the ball. Okay. There's only one measure that predicts salary but not points. So broadly, it seems that the obvious team type variables predict points and salary. Expected goals and plus minus do pretty well. Now I want to add to that because I just found this morning, in addition to those three variables in the first column, it turns out that long pass completion and midfield touches do actually matter for points and salary. And that's sort of, hot off the press this morning. So even my co-authors don't know about that one. So there's a bit more to tell on that first column. Is there a Moneyball story here? Well, not really. Because if you think what happened with the Moneyball story and the way this was approached in various papers, it was walks by the hitter, which seemed to explain wins for the teams in baseball, but not salary. So that's going to the second column. We've got a bit going on there, shot creation, progressive distance of passes, and assists, maybe predict points, but not salary. But it's rather hard to build a story to say, well, really, players are actually underpaid if they do more of these things. Maybe we haven't looked hard enough, but there's more work to be done on that. So some conclusions then, after what was a quite considerable set of results. The Who Scored ratings are a good predictor of player salaries. It's a useful heuristic, although it's incomplete. We found limited evidence that teams take account of basic and analytic measures of performance for salary. Now, these, of course, are proxies. We're never saying someone goes into the boardroom and talks about progressive distance of passes for a player. The only example I can give you that's kind of remotely connected to what actually goes on in a bargain is Kevin De Bruyne at Manchester City, who he had agents, obviously, but he partly represented himself in the contract negotiation, and he brought a dossier with him into the boardroom at Manchester City. And Kevin De Bruyne argued that his pass completion rate was not a good measure of his capability. Now, you think, hang on, he's a midfield player, surely he should be completing his passes. But actually, there's some sense to his view, because Kevin De Bruyne makes ambitious passes. He's the playmaker, he's providing the crosses right now for Haaland, and he's very good at it. He's the one providing key passes for shots, assists. He's king of assists right now. So he's not so bothered about pass completion because his passes are much further forward, they're long quite often, and they're more risky. And fortunately for him, if he loses the ball, well, he's got someone like Rodri to clear up the mess afterwards. So different players will have strengths, and they will bring those strengths to the table, or if they don't, their agents will do so on their behalf. Kevin De Bruyne is a bright fellow, so he's capable of representing himself. I don't think Raheem Sterling, with all due respect, quite has that capability. So we can't really pin down actual bargains here, but we can think about correlations and associations here. What we've got at the moment, which is a tantalizing position for us, and we welcome feedback, is imperfect alignment of pay determination with team points determination. It's not exact at all. We've got pointers. We're finding plus minus to be quite powerful in explaining both aspects. We want to go further and probe further into which variables affect wins and are not directly rewarded by salary. We're not at the end of the story regarding sort of Moneyball type effects here. There's more to be done. Having said that, we've got to write up sometime, otherwise someone else will do it for us. So we don't want to be scooped. We're going to write up real quick and hopefully push it towards a journal here. But I've talked for long enough, so I'll shut up there and invite any questions.
Great, thank you very much, Rob. And we've got lots of time for questions and comments. Stefan.
No, Stefan not there.
No, I'm here.
Excellent.
Can you? No, my camera's not working. Sorry, but so you just get the black screen. Apologies. So very interesting, Rob. And of course, you'd expect me to raise some questions. I mean, you and I have been arguing with this for 20 years or more, right? So, so actually, on your final point about this imperfect alignment, I think that's quite straightforward, isn't it? I mean, basically, why did you hire Lionel Messi? Well, he's a good footballer and you might win games with him, but there's a lot more to it than that, right? It's the star, yeah. it's his ability off the pitch to generate revenue and interest. So I think that's probably the obvious way to look for that. But more broadly, and going back to our 20+ year argument, I would say there is, if I were to boil that down to two things, they would be this. Firstly, that you can, the ability is in some sense observable. And then the issue of, can you measure player salaries? And on the second one, I think as you mentioned, there are question marks against all the claimed measures of individual salaries in the past, and I think you're getting closer with this capology thing. I'm still slightly skeptical. Certainly if you're running regression, I'd want to have player agent dummies. Soccer football agents have an incredibly bad reputation for being scoundrels, and so I don't know. That means you shouldn't necessarily trust what they say their client is being paid. But I don't know. I do think you're getting closer with that, and I think that's on the positive. On the other side, though, I really want to claim victory now. I want to say that you now agree with me. Ability is observable, and so the shirking model is now, you've demonstrated, is completely mistaken. It cannot be theoretically correct that you would base salaries, you would have a shirking contract when effort is observable. When effort is observable, principal agent incentive theory tells us that you have a forcing contract. You pay people if they produce the output that you contracted them for. And as you show, ability, as I've always said, is observable. You can see how good these people are. And these statistics are just putting that observability into numbers, right? That's all it's doing. It's translating what we always knew into quantifiable statistics. And, okay, so it turns out some work better than others, but again, I would say this was stuff that we always knew.
No, I don't disagree at all. In fact, I think we are in agreement, because the 2015 Scottish Journal paper showed that, although admittedly, what I didn't say to the audience was that the measure of player performance in that paper was actually kicker ratings, and not something which is exactly observable. But even so, yeah, I do agree with you, Stefan, but there's still a kind of nagging doubt. Stefan, how would you deal with the Ozil case that I mentioned earlier?
Well, I think, so one thing I would say is that clearly not 100% of everything that people do is observable. And people have said, it's before, they might not do their training out of season correctly. That's not being observed. And so that's one explanation why there might be some minor deviations. And the other explanation might be that, you know, as you were saying, there's just bias. You know, Özil is become a hate figure among many fans, right? And so it's just prejudice and bias, right? So I don't see, but I don't see why one should necessarily agree with the critics about how that is. But again, my point would be, yes, there might be minor parts that are unobservable, but as you show, you can explain the overwhelming an overwhelming majority of the variation in salary with observable characteristics. So, you know, those claims about shirking and references to principal agent theory and stuff like that, that all should be, we should say, no, that's not right. In this particular industry, and unlike most labor markets, and what sets this aside is that performance is observable, quantifiable, and therefore salary can be conditioned on observables.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. No problem with that at all.
20 years, now we agree. That's great.
Anything's possible, Stefan.
Well, I'm very pleased. Good. Anyway, great paper, really interesting.
Thank you. Thanks, Stefan. Good.
Thanks, Stefan. Pedro is next.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Very interesting talk, as usual, Rob. I do have a couple of comments on methods and then a suggestion. The comment, well, the first one is about the data and the explanatory variables. I think it is crucial to keep controlling for injuries, especially regarding this control variable of the minutes played. I might have lost something, but in principle, understood that you use this explanatory variable of the minutes per 90 minutes. And then obviously it all depends also on the availability of players to be ready for playing. And that is implicitly a measurement of the quality of the players. So there could also be some correlation with other regressors. That's one point. The second point about modeling, I suppose the use of quantile regression, that's great. I think that's the best strategy. But I wonder to what extent implementing the logarithm transformation does not typically correct for this skewness that you mentioned.
Surely not.
Yeah,
no,
finally, and that's perhaps some clarification in case I missed something. And my suggestion, because I find it very, very interesting and very promising for future research, I find it, you know, very simple but very clever strategy when you distinguish between regressors that predict salaries versus regressors that can explain wins, particularly that issue of effort being relevant. So the research avenue to me, or the interpretation of the facts, could be opposing pure talent against effort. And it seems to me sensible to think that, you know, in the contracts, they value a lot the amount of effort being elicited by the players, no matter whether the effort is eventually translating to wins. And that I think is very promising avenue for research.
Okay.
Again, thanks.
Thanks, Pedro. Those are interesting points. Couple of things to come back on. In terms of injuries, if we were, we were trying to think along the way about omitted variable bias, and therefore instrumental variables. To the extent injuries are random, they may not be, but if they are random, then that's a candidate for an instrument, perhaps, for the composite measure, for example, the who scored rating or the plus minus. So that would be something that would be interesting to pursue. We don't have injury data here, so that's something that's absent, I think, in the FBRF. And even if we had it, we wouldn't know, how to categorize the injuries necessarily. That would be a bit difficult.
I think, Rob, you can get that from TransferMark. It is not easy. Okay, it's not straightforward to find, but there is this colored 6 categories, I think, whether the player is ready, is playing for the second category team, or is injured, and so on. I can't tell you where to get that.
Thanks. That's a good point, and we'll take a look at that. So that is useful. The second major point you made was about effort and talent. A couple of things that could be applied here. One is discipline. We know certainly how many yellow and red cards that players collect. When we've introduced those measures, those are clearly available, not just on FBref, those are generally available. Those don't do anything to explain salary. And I'm not surprised, because getting a yellow card is kind of a natural hazard of the game. Everyone gets them to some extent, and it's just part of it. Red cards, well, they're also kind of hazards of the game, I suppose, to some extent. A lot of them are, for example, are for denying a goal-scoring opportunity. Well, that's when you're taking one for the team, perhaps. So that doesn't work. Another approach which has been used in the literature for effort is distance run. But then I worry about the kind of headless chicken type problem. Lots of players run around with no useful end product. So I don't know where we go with that. But yeah, those are certainly interesting things to consider. So those are great points, Pedro. So thanks for that.
Great, thanks, Pedro. Then we've got Carl next.
Hi, Carl.
Thanks. Hi, Rob. Just a couple of questions or maybe ideas. So I was wondering about the timing of your variables. So are you treating it like a spot contract? So that this is, or are you more thinking about it from the perspective of our players overpaid, underpaid, as opposed to what determines the wage that they have now, and more as a function of their past information? So I wondered whether you think about just lagging stuff and seeing what happens.
Yeah, I mean, we've only got a short time frame with this data set. So we've only got 4 seasons. So I think that constrains the use of lags. I mean, previously, separate to this paper, I had one on consistency of player performance with Anil Ozdemir and Giambattista Rossi. And we found that players who were performing consistently got rewarded for that attribute, but here we can't really get too far with that because of the short time frame.
Sure.
So I think that holds that up a bit. But I think you're right. That would be interesting. We're not really going full on in terms of identifying overpayment or underpayment. We're being fairly reserved about that. We don't want to claim too much at this point. So I don't want to kind of overburden the paper with that sort of terminology, if you like.
Sure. And then, sorry, my other question was about, well, just recommendation. But I'd be very curious to see things according to the experience of the player and the age, because again, that's another thing where the size of the information set is getting bigger and bigger over time, right?
Okay. And of course, you've got a paper in I think Industrial Relations, which did precisely that. And I think if I read it right, Carl, you found a discrepancy between the peak of performance and the peak of salary for Major League Soccer. So those weren't in line.
Yeah, the thing that we found that we couldn't really understand, well, we didn't find a reason for really, was that wages just go up and up and up long after performance seems to have plateaued or peaked.
What I would say here, you're right, we could say a lot more, we will do in the write-up. As far as age is concerned, the peak age for salary turns out to be 26/27.
Yeah, that sounds
right? Yeah.
Well, it's very small sample compared to you, but yeah, that's the same in Major League Soccer.
Yeah, that's right. So, and the experience measure, we could indeed say more about that, but 2 things were introduced. One was number of minutes, not games, in your career so far. And also, on top of that, the number of minutes played in the top 5 European leagues. And it turns out both were significant, and playing in the European, what we call elite leagues, gave you a salary premium.
Could be a superstar effect, right? Exposure.
It's large. It could well be driven by that, but I think it's a bit more general than just superstars. It's through the distribution, actually.
Right.
Sorry, I want just to make that point. I think that these outliers or these behavior you just mentioned, deviating from performances, this can affect more intensively to superstar players. And the whole point is the obvious point I didn't mention, but the contribution is not only in field, but also off field, especially concerning these superstar players. So that is something you can also consider controlling for. Maybe, you know, the obvious case is Cristiano Ronaldo. When you hire these very experienced and older than other players, but what you get is the asset of this reputation and long-lasting career. That's exactly what you do.
Yeah, that's a great point. And of course, you've done it before with Google Hits and people use Facebook likes and that kind of thing. Although possibly that's an extra paper.
Yeah.
Thanks.
More questions and comments? Yeah, thanks, Pedro. Any more questions and comments online? Looks like there isn't. So thank you very much, Rob. Real pleasure to have you here with us in Reading. Thank you everyone online. Good to see everyone. And we will be back again next week. Next week we have, what are we, March the 8th, Mario Lackner is going to present When Performance Melts Away. Heat causes individuals to make more mental mistakes in high stakes competitions. So hope to see you all again next week for that. And in the meantime, wish you all a great weekend. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for that. I was really pleased with how that went. I like that. I feel we're a lot nearer getting to a light up.
Good stuff. Yeah. We've just got to turn off on this machine as well.
Yeah, so we'll let you do that.
So the whole world doesn't hear our conversation.
Yeah. Excellent, thank you. How many people